The Apostle Paul had a problem. At least he had what you and I would call a problem. Actually, it was a pretty big problem, one that very much affected the course of his ministry, and at one point even threatened to derail it entirely. It was no secret. Everyone knew about the problem, at least everyone who had any dealings with Paul, so he never bothered to mention exactly what it was in any of his letters, at least any of those letters that have come down to us. I mean, they all knew what the problem was. He didn't have to tell them, but as a result, because he never says, we don't know what it was. Which, of course, has never stopped people over the years from trying to guess just what it may have been. From what Paul does say, it seems to have been some kind of physical or behavioral issue, something that at times affected his public demeanor, which has led some to suggest that it may have been a very bad stutter or some other kind of speech impediment, while others have suggested, on the basis of a single verse in 2 Corinthians, it was actually part of one of our epistle readings just a few weeks ago, that it may have been even epilepsy or something like that. The fact is, we don't know what the problem was, and all of our guesses are just that, guesses. But whatever it was, on occasion, it made Paul the target of a great deal of criticism and even ridicule, leading some to go so far as to claim that the problem was so severe as to raise doubts about Paul's claim to be an apostle. And why, you might ask, would such a problem, what we would call a disability, be grounds for someone rejecting Paul's credentials as an apostle? Why? Because then, just as now, no one expects an apostle or any other prominent figure in our society to have something like a stutter, much less something even more disabling. No, then, just as now, they expected their leaders to be, and they actually had a special word for this, they expected them to be godlike. Not gods, but godlike. Meaning not absolutely perfect, but pretty close. Certainly no stutter, not an apostle. Now that may sound terribly judgmental to our ears, even just flat out prejudiced on their part, but it certainly shouldn't strike any of us as surprising. We do exactly the same thing. Do you really think that this or any other church would ever call a pastor who had a severe stutter? I doubt it. And yet the most brilliant scholar I've ever known had the worst stutter I have ever heard. A man named Peter Brown. When I was in divinity school, he came to the university to give a lecture, and I looked forward to it for weeks because this man had written brilliant things. And yet when he stood up to talk, I couldn't believe it. I was stunned. Never in 1,000 years would I have imagined that a scholar of that magnitude could have hardly made it through a sentence. Somehow that just didn't compute, because we expect our heroes to be, well, godlike. It's the same reason why, when we read in the Gospel of Luke the story about Zacchaeus climbing up a tree in order to see Jesus because he was short, we just automatically assume that Luke means that it's Zacchaeus who was short, not because there's anything at all in the sentence structure to suggest that, but because it simply never occurs to us to imagine Jesus as short. No, of course not. Our Jesus is tall. And there's even a touch of this sort of thing in our gospel lesson for today. The story of Jesus' return to his hometown of Nazareth. Now, Mark tells us that it was a Sabbath. And as he normally did on the Sabbath, Jesus went to the synagogue and spoke to the congregation. He wowed them. They were amazed until they realized who he was. "Isn't that the carpenter?" someone said. And suddenly the tone shifted from amazement to disbelief and even offense. Who does he think he is? And why the change? Well, who imagines their rabbi as a carpenter? Interestingly enough, apparently not even Matthew. Because in his account of this story, the crowd doesn't ask, "Isn't that the carpenter?" as in Mark, but rather, "Isn't that the son of the carpenter?" And that, by the way, are the only two places in the Bible that either Jesus or Joseph is ever one called a carpenter. I think that anyone who works with the disabled will tell you that the biggest problem they have is not their disability, but rather the prejudice that others have toward them because of their disability, and all the assumptions then about their capabilities that follow in the wake of such prejudice. And I do think that's a problem we all need to be aware of and do a better job attempting to avoid in our own dealings with the disabled. But there's a flip side to this problem that may be even more dangerous and certainly even more destructive. For just as we too often quickly presume that those who are disabled are in some measure deficient, so too do we assume too quickly that those who embody our ideals of physical prowess or mental acuity are in some measure blessed and possess then of abilities that are godlike. There's no better example, but perhaps I should say no worse example of what I'm talking about than King David. You see, David had it all. He was, by all accounts, extremely handsome in appearance, a warrior absolutely without equal, and very, very persuasive. The people of Israel adored him because he was exactly what they wanted a king to be. And best of all, he looked the part, every bit of it. He looked like a king. And the greater the heights that David attained, the more invincible he thought himself to be. Now, I don't know how much you know about David, because our lectionary readings in worship cover only a very small portion of the whole scriptural account of his life, which is, I think, a terrible shame. A shame because the story of David, as it's told in 1 and 2 Samuel, is really and truly one of the great literary treasures of the Bible. A truly epic and in many ways tragic story of what might have been. If you only read the little bits and pieces of the story, like the famous story of David and Goliath, for example, if that's all you know, then you don't ever really see the big picture, the whole story, including all the little signs along the way that David is coming closer and closer to crossing a line. To crossing a line and beginning to think of himself as invincible, as one who can do no wrong, as one even who is godlike. Our Old Testament lesson for today is one of those little signs. Yet interestingly enough, the lectionary selection for today actually omits what I think are the critical verses here, which, however, we did make sure to read. Here we learn that David has been crowned king of all the tribes of Israel. And he immediately then sets out to establish his capital in the city of Jerusalem, a city that up till that time had belonged to the Jebusites, one of the many small Canaanite city-states in that region. And after capturing Jerusalem, the very impressive maneuver, David begins then to build up the city, which is now to be called the City of David, to build it up with impressive public buildings. The real beginning of the city we think of even today as Jerusalem. But in this account, there's a sour note sounded. A sour note in the account of David's plans for the city. One little thing that when you hear it, you really can't help but shake your head and wonder, why did he do that? Because you see, Scripture tells us that David banished the blind and the lame from his city. Now, there's a reason given as to why he did that. A reason that I must confess to my cynical ears sounds more like an excuse than a reason. An excuse in the place of the real reason, which I suspect was simply that David did not want any beggars on the streets of his city, because he wanted a beautiful city that would be fit for a great king. And nobody said anything because David was the king. He was the king who had defeated all of their enemies around them, the king who could do no wrong. A king who could do no wrong, that is, until he did. And like a lot of people who think they can do no wrong, when he did, it was a whopper. All of which brings us back to the stuttering apostle, or whatever it was the problem was. What Paul called a thorn in his flesh, a messenger of Satan sent to torment him. Paul says that he begged the Lord 3 different times to remove the problem from him. But each time the Lord refused. And from that point on, Paul never spoke of his affliction as a problem again. Not that he ever called it a blessing or anything like that. But still, this problem was for Paul a very valuable and constant reminder of the fundamental fact of all human life. The fundamental fact that God's ways are not our ways. That what we think of as power and influence and strength in the long run amount to very little. That what we so often consider godlike has almost nothing to do with God at all. That in fact, the only truly godlike thing that Paul or any of us will ever do is to bear our own cross, whatever that is, and to bear it when we are discouraged, when even we are all but defeated, and yet to keep on. Because that is the most godlike thing we can do.